I still remember the moment my daughter-in-law smiled and called my life's work a small investment. It was not loud or cruel on the surface, just casually dismissive, said at the dinner table as if it were a fact everyone should agree on. My son stayed silent. Her father watched, confident, as though the future already belonged to them. In that instant, something cracked inside me, not loudly, but permanently, because what they saw as small was built from decades of restraint, sacrifice, and quiet discipline. And that underestimation would change everything in ways none of them were prepared for. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how these stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we are truly grateful to have you here. If you have not already, do not forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with resilience, hidden strength, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. My name is Woodjane Claire Mitchell, and I am 58 years old. I have lived in Fort Collins, Colorado for most of my adult life, in a small weathered house not far from the Cache La Poudre River. From my kitchen window, I can see cottonwood trees bending with the wind, and on clear mornings, the distant outline of the foothills. It is quiet here, quiet enough that I can hear my own thoughts, which was not always something I welcomed. My husband died 12 years ago from a sudden heart condition. One day, he was complaining about feeling tired. The next day, I was signing hospital forms I barely understood. Widowed is a word that sounds distant until it becomes your name. After the funeral, there was no dramatic collapse, no moment where the world stopped. There was only a practical silence and a list of things that still needed to be done. Bills still arrived, the house still needed heat, and our son Ethan still needed his mother to stand upright. I learned quickly that survival is not loud. It happens quietly, in routine. I began waking up early, long before sunrise, brewing cheap coffee and walking along the river while the town slept. I took work where I could find it. During the day, I served as an administrative secretary at a local high school, answering phones and filing paperwork. In the evenings, I worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small church, balancing accounts that barely balanced themselves. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest, and it kept us steady. Outwardly, my life never appeared ambitious. I drove a battered Toyota Camry from 2008 that rattled when it was cold. I shopped sales, repaired rather than replaced, and took pride in never owing more than I could repay. To anyone watching, I was a careful woman living a narrow life. What no one ever saw were my nights. When Ethan went to bed and the house finally fell silent, I opened my laptop and began reading. Municipal finance reports, dividend statements, long, dry documents about infrastructure bonds and community investment funds that most people scroll past without a second thought. I studied the financial health of cities the way some people study novels, learning their patterns, their risks, their quiet strengths. Over time, reading became habit, and habit became discipline. I started investing 15 years ago, cautiously and consistently. I bought Denver municipal bonds. I held dividend-paying stocks that did not promise excitement, but delivered reliability. Most importantly, I contributed to the Front Range Community Development Fund, a local investment group focused on housing, energy, and small businesses throughout Colorado. I never invested to impress. I invested to endure. Ethan grew up watching only the surface of my life. He knew I worked. He knew I worried. What he did not know was how carefully every decision had been calculated, how every small deposit carried intention. When he graduated college and became a software engineer in Boulder, I was proud, but I did not suddenly change the rules of how I lived. That was before Haley Lang entered our lives. Haley was everything I was not. Young, confident, polished. She spoke comfortably about venture capital and growth metrics, about money, as if it were an abstract game rather than something that quietly determines your freedom. Her father, Robert Lang, founded Lang Capital Partners in Denver, and in his presence, people listened. When I stood beside them, I felt invisible in a way I had not felt since the earliest days of widowhood. And yet, I never resented it. I allowed the world to think I was simple. I allowed silence to misrepresent me, because under the quiet surface of my life was something patient and steadily growing, like the river outside my window. And rivers, I had learned, do their most powerful work without ever asking to be noticed. If you are still watching and starting to sense where this story is heading, please comment number 1 below so I know you are with me, because what happens next turns quiet sacrifice into the first real test. Now, let us move on to Chapter 2. Denver always feels louder than Fort Collins. The sidewalks move faster, the buildings rise closer together, and everyone seems to be walking towards something urgent. That Friday evening, as I drove south on Interstate 25, I reminded myself why I was there. Ethan had insisted. Haley had just been promoted, and this dinner mattered to them. So I went, telling myself that being uncomfortable for a few hours was a small price to pay for staying close to my son. The restaurant sat high above downtown, all glass and polished metal, glowing against the early winter dark. Inside, the air smelled like money and ambition. I smoothed my dress, one I had owned for years, and followed Ethan to the table where Haley and her friends were already seated. They were young, confident, impeccably dressed, their conversations flowing without effort. I felt like a visitor stepping into a world that had its own language. The talk never slowed. Valuations, growth projections, strategic partnerships, exits. Words stacked on words until they lost meaning. I listened quietly, hands folded in my lap, observing more than participating. This was not my arena, and I knew better than to force myself into it. I had spent most of my adulthood learning when silence was wiser than noise. Then Ethan did what sons often do when they are nervous and eager at the same time. He tried to bridge the gap. He mentioned that I invested too, that I preferred municipal bonds and community funds tied to real projects. The table paused for half a second, just long enough for everyone to turn toward me. Haley smiled, not cruelly, not openly, just enough for the meaning to land. She called it sweet, something retirees do to stay busy. A hobby. Someone laughed softly. Another sip of wine followed. The conversation resumed as if nothing essential had been said. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, that quiet burn of being dismissed. It was not the first time. It likely would not be the last. Robert Lang watched from across the table, his expression unreadable. He did not join in, but he offered no correction either. His silence carried its own weight, a quiet agreement that placed me where he believed I belonged. I chose my words carefully and spoke only once, saying I liked investments tied to communities and long horizons. It was not a defense. It was a statement of fact. The response came gently but firmly, framed as advice. I was told I should enjoy retirement, leave complexity to professionals. The message was clear enough. What none of them could see was the irony settling over the table like dust. I knew the reports. I had read the minutes. The community fund Haley had just dismissed was preparing to finalize a purchase in Denver, a redevelopment deal tied to a commercial complex facing financial pressure. Buried within that property was a building tied directly to Lang Capital Partners. The timing was delicate, the leverage was real, and my investment, accumulated slowly over years, was part of what gave the fund a seat at that negotiation. I did not say any of this. I finished my meal, smiled at the appropriate moments, and congratulated Haley on her success. When the evening ended, the goodbyes were polite and perfectly hollow. I walked alone to my car, the cold air sharp against my face, the city lights flickering like distant signals. On the drive home, the word small echoed in my mind. Small investment, small life, small expectations. I had learned long ago that small, when repeated with discipline, rarely remains small for long. As Denver disappeared behind me and the road opened into darkness, I understood that the dinner had shifted something. Not outwardly, not yet, but the fault lines were there now, drawn quietly beneath the table, waiting for pressure to do what it always does. And pressure, I knew, was coming. If this moment made you uneasy and you feel the tension beginning to rise, comment number 2 below to let me know you are still here. The next chapter is where words turn into consequences. Let us continue with chapter 3. After the dinner in Denver, Fort Collins felt quieter than usual, as if the city itself were holding its breath. I returned to my routines out of habit rather than comfort. The morning walks by the river continued, the school office still needed filing, and the church account still had to reconcile. Yet beneath everything ran a thin current of unease. I could not forget the way Haley had smiled or the way Robert Lang had looked through me, as if I were part of the furniture. More than that, I could not forget Ethan's face at the table, caught between pride and discomfort. The following Sunday afternoon, Ethan came by without calling ahead. I knew something was wrong the moment I opened the door. His shoulders were tight, his movements rushed, like someone who had rehearsed a difficult conversation too many times. We sat at the kitchen table where he had once done his homework while I checked payroll ledgers after midnight shifts. I poured tea. He barely touched it. He began by talking around the problem. Haley's company, he said, was preparing for another funding round. There was momentum, excitement, but also pressure. Deadlines were closing in. Investors wanted reassurance. The words came fast, as if speed might make them less heavy. Finally, he looked at me and asked how liquid my investments were. The number came next, $100,000. I did not answer right away. I felt the weight of that figure settle in my chest, not because it was shocking, but because I knew exactly what it represented. 15 years of discipline, 15 years of choosing patience over comfort. That money was not sitting idle. It was my insurance against illness, against age, against becoming a burden. It was the reason I slept at night without calculating worst-case scenarios. I told Ethan the truth. I said I did not understand Haley's company well enough. I said technology moves fast, faster than my margin for error. I said I had made a rule long ago never to invest in something I could not explain to myself on paper. My voice was steady. My hands were not. The disappointment hit him immediately. Not anger at first, but disbelief, as if I had violated an unspoken obligation. He talked about opportunity, about access, about how people like Haley create wealth by seeing possibilities others miss. The words felt strangely distant, as though he were repeating something he had been taught rather than something he believed. Then he said it, that maybe Haley was right. Maybe I simply did not understand how real money was made anymore. The room went still. I remember watching the steam rise from my teacup and thinking how fragile moments like this were, how easily years of trust could crack without making a sound. I wanted to remind him of nights when the checkbook barely balanced, when real money meant groceries and rent and keeping the lights on. I wanted to say that everything he had came from decisions made carefully, not quickly. Instead, I said nothing. Ethan left soon after, apologizing with his eyes but not his words. The door closed gently behind him. When the engine of his car faded down the street, the house felt larger than it was. That evening, as I organized paperwork at my desk, my phone buzzed with a message intended for Ethan. It was from Haley. I did not mean to read it, but the screen lit up before I could look away. She called me cautious in a way that sounded like accusation, selfish in a way that sounded rehearsed, and ignorant in a way that hurt more than I expected. I set the phone down and stared at the wall. The realization came quietly. This was no longer just about investment philosophy. It was about control, about who was trusted to decide the future and whose judgment could be dismissed without consequence. I gathered my files and stacked them neatly. There was no argument strong enough to fix what words had shaken. If this situation was going to resolve itself, it would not be through explanation or defense. It would be through preparation, through the only language I had ever truly relied on. Numbers do not raise their voices, but they do not lie either. If you are still watching and wondering how a small investment could threaten an entire family dynamic, comment number 3 below so I know you are following closely. What comes next is the turning point no one expects. Let us move on to chapter 4. After Ethan left that Sunday, the house felt heavier than it had in years. Not louder, not chaotic, just weighted with things unsaid. I did not chase after explanations or send follow-up messages. Experience had taught me that words offered at the wrong moment only harden resistance. Instead, I did what I had always done when life threatened to unravel. I sat down and went back to the numbers. That night, I opened my laptop at the small desk by the window, the same one where I had once balanced late utility bills and college application fees. The folders were familiar, organized by year and category, my quiet archive of survival. I reviewed my municipal bonds first, confirming maturities and interest schedules. Then the dividend holdings, steady as ever. No surprises, no drama. That steadiness calmed me. Finally, I opened the file for the Front Range Community Development Fund. I had invested there longer than anywhere else, increasing my contributions slowly as my confidence grew. The returns were modest but consistent, and tied to projects I could stand beside without apology. Affordable housing, renewable energy, redevelopment plans that prioritized function over flash. An email notification caught my attention. An invitation to an in-person investor meeting at Denver City Hall. I rarely attended. These gatherings were not designed for recognition, and I never sought it. But this time felt different. Not urgent in tone, but sharp in implication. The subject line referenced a prospective acquisition. I read the attached summary twice. 2 days later, I drove down to Denver and parked several blocks away, choosing to walk despite the cold. City Hall rose ahead of me, unpretentious compared to the finance towers downtown. Inside, the meeting room was modest. Metal chairs, folding tables, the hum of quiet conversation. I recognized the faces I always saw in quarterly reports, but rarely in person. Teachers, nurses, retired engineers, people whose wealth, like mine, had been built slowly and invisibly. The director of the fund presented the proposal in measured tones. A commercial complex near downtown, long neglected, burdened by aggressive financing and declining occupancy. The current owners needed liquidity. The banks were pressing. The opportunity lay in purchasing low, stabilizing, and repurposing thoughtfully. Halfway through, a name surfaced. Lang Capital Partners. I felt no immediate shock, only a subtle tightening, as if pieces I had sensed but not named suddenly aligned. The property represented a pressure point in their portfolio, high leverage, declining performance. The kind of asset that looks fine until it does not. The room remained calm. Questions were asked, risks acknowledged. The focus stayed on feasibility, not emotion. That discipline was what had drawn me to this fund in the first place. When the discussion turned to governance and voting thresholds, I realized my position more clearly than I ever had before. My investment history placed me among the longest standing individual contributors. I had never needed that status until now. When it was time for comments, I stood and spoke briefly. I emphasized continuity, accountability, protection for existing small tenants who would be affected by redevelopment decisions. I did not mention families or dinners or anything personal. This was business, and it demanded clarity, not grievance. The vote passed. I signed my name on the approval sheet with a steadiness that surprised even me. The pen moved smoothly, no hesitation. It was not a dramatic act, just a deliberate one. Driving home that evening, the sun dipped low over the plains, casting long shadows across the highway. I thought about Ethan and Haley, about how unaware they were of the lines already being redrawn. I felt no triumph, no resentment, only awareness. Some conflicts are not solved by persuasion. They evolve as decisions accumulate, quietly, patiently. I understood then that this was no longer about defending myself. It was about standing firm in a system I understood better than anyone realized. And systems, once set in motion, rarely stop where you expect them to. If everything so far feels calm, but you sense that the ground is shifting underneath it all, comment number 4 below to stay with me, because the next chapter is where the tension finally explodes. Let us move on to chapter 5. The unraveling did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, carried on half-finished sentences and late-night silences. I first noticed it through Ethan. His calls became shorter, his voice strained, as if he were constantly apologizing for taking up space. When I asked how work was going, he answered carefully, avoiding specifics. I recognized the pattern. It was the sound of someone trying to keep bad news from spreading. Within weeks, the rumors surfaced. The fintech startup where Haley worked was struggling. At first, it was talk of delays, a postponed product launch, clients hesitating. Then the language sharpened, allegations of copied software architecture, key partners quietly stepping away, investors asking questions no one seemed prepared to answer. The official announcement came on a gray Wednesday afternoon. The company filed for bankruptcy protection. Employees were dismissed with little notice. Equity evaporated overnight. What had been described as momentum collapsed into silence. Haley lost her job along with everyone else, but the damage did not stop there. She had personally guaranteed part of a short-term corporate loan, something she had described as routine, manageable. Now the bank wanted answers. Their downtown Denver apartment, once a symbol of arrival, suddenly became a liability rather than an asset. Ethan came to see me again. Exhaustion etched into his face. He talked in circles, explaining the blame, the confusion, the fear of not knowing what might come next. He did not accuse me outright, but I could hear Haley's words behind his own. The suggestion that my refusal to invest had tipped the balance, that $100,000 might have bought more time, might have changed the outcome. I listened without interruption. I did not remind him that companies worth saving do not hinge on money they never had. I did not mention risk models or structural weaknesses. I folded my hands and kept my voice even. This was no longer about logic. It was about grief wearing the shape of anger. Haley did not limit herself to private frustration. In her retelling, I became something else entirely. The cautious widow who refused to support her son. The financially naive mother clinging to outdated beliefs. The unseen force holding Ethan back from his potential. Those versions of me traveled quickly once spoken aloud. Through Haley, the story reached Robert Lang. Until then, Robert had remained distant, controlled, observing rather than reacting. Now he asked questions, requested timelines, inquired indirectly about how assets within families were structured. The tone shifted from curiosity to evaluation, as if my choices had become variables in his calculations. Then came the legal suggestion, not a threat, not yet, merely the idea floated by someone close to him, a lawyer with a polished voice and a flexible sense of concern. He wondered aloud whether the way I managed funds connected to Ethan could be reviewed, simply as precaution, to ensure there had been no undue influence, no improper withholding of opportunity. The implication landed with precision. In that moment, I understood that the conflict had crossed a line. This was no longer disappointment or resentment. It was an attempt to redefine responsibility in a way that placed risk on my shoulders. Emotion was being translated into accusation. Personal decisions were being reframed as obstruction. I did not panic. Panic belongs to people who act without preparation. I felt instead a steady clarity settle in. The realization that silence, which had once protected me, could now be mistaken for weakness. That choosing not to explain had allowed others to explain me instead. I looked again at the path behind me. Years of quiet consistency, disciplined choices, documented decisions. There was nothing hidden in my record, but I understood that truth only matters if you are prepared to present it. Something had shifted permanently. The narrative no longer rested in the realm of opinion. It was entering systems that respect only evidence. And systems, once engaged, do not care who feels wronged or misunderstood. As I organized my files that night, I knew one thing with certainty. The next phase would not be decided at a kitchen table or over a glass of wine. It would be decided in rooms where facts replace feelings. And I was ready for both. By the time the meeting was proposed, I already understood what was really being asked of me. It was not about clarification or reconciliation. It was about control. If I stayed away, if I allowed lawyers and intermediaries to speak on my behalf, the narrative would harden without me in it. I had spent my life proving that silence could be strength, but I knew this was not one of those moments. Ethan called to tell me the time and place. A law office in downtown Denver, glass and steel rising above the street like a statement of authority. His voice was careful, weighed down. He said it might be better if I kept things calm, avoided escalation, let the professionals handle it. I thanked him and told him I would be there. What I did not say was that I had already decided how I would enter that room. I did not prepare as a mother or a peacemaker. I prepared as I always had when faced with risk. I reviewed my records, every contribution I had made to the Front Range Community Development Fund over the years, dates, amounts, voting rights. I spoke briefly with the fund's director, not to dramatize the situation, but to confirm my standing. Nothing more was needed. The facts were solid. The law office was exactly what I expected. Polished surfaces, cool lighting, chairs designed more for status than comfort. Robert Lang sat near the head of the table with his attorney beside him. Haley was there too, composed but rigid, the strain visible in the way she held herself. I nodded once and took my seat without ceremony. The discussion began where these things always begin, with procedure, asset valuation, market pressures. The commercial complex was reviewed in a neutral language, its weaknesses exposed cleanly and without apology. Lang Capital's need for liquidity was evident, even if no one said the word aloud. Their leverage had run thin. When the representative from the community fund spoke, the tone shifted slightly. He explained the structure of the offer, the conditions for redevelopment, the capital already committed. Then he did something I had not predicted, though perhaps I should have. He acknowledged the long-term individual investors whose consistent contributions had allowed the fund to move independently without heavy institutional backing. That was when Robert looked at me fully for the first time. He asked a question framed politely about the source of such stability. The fund director answered simply, small investors, retirees, working professionals, and one in particular, he added, whose sustained participation gave the fund its financial backbone. My name was spoken plainly, without emphasis. There was a pause, not dramatic, just long enough to register. Robert's expression changed, subtly but unmistakably. He did the calculation himself. The realization settled in, not as embarrassment, but as correction. He acknowledged it aloud, not to defend himself, not to flatter me, but because denial would have made negotiation impossible. He said that the fund's position, strengthened by disciplined individual capital, had altered the balance of the discussion, that these contributions, often dismissed as marginal, were now decisive. I did not respond. There was nothing to add. Across the table, I felt the shift ripple outward. Haley's composure tightened. Ethan, seated beside her, stared forward, absorbing what this meant. The narrative had inverted without anyone raising their voice. No defenses were needed. The structure of the room had done the work. The meeting continued. Terms were refined, timelines adjusted. When it concluded, there were no apologies, no overt acknowledgments of past condescension. None were required. Recognition had already been given its proper form. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the noise of Denver rushed in around me. Traffic, footsteps, the ordinary movement of a city unaware of quiet reversals taking place inside its buildings. I felt no triumph, only relief. Relief that I had chosen presence over avoidance. Some truths do not need arguing. They only need to be seen in the right light, at the right table. And once seen, they cannot be set aside again. If you are still here, and you just realized how deeply they underestimated her, comment number 6 below, so I know you are paying attention. The story is about to reveal the true cost of that mistake. Now, let us move on to Chapter 7. The meeting ended without ceremony, but its effects moved quickly and quietly through every life it touched. As I returned to Fort Collins, I understood that nothing dramatic needed to happen for the balance to change. It already had. People rarely notice the exact moment authority shifts, only the discomfort that follows when old assumptions stop holding. Financially, the outcome was clear. The Front Range Community Development Fund finalized the purchase under its terms. The agreement was clean, the timelines firm. Lang Capital Partners complied without protest, but the strain showed. They did not collapse, not publicly, but their posture changed. Press releases softened. Language shifted from confidence to caution. Partners who once praised aggressive positioning began praising stability instead. That kind of adjustment speaks louder than headlines. Robert Lang no longer treated me like a peripheral complication. When our paths crossed again, his attention was measured, professional. The ease of assumed superiority was gone. He did not apologize, nor did I expect him to. Men like Robert adjust rather than confess. Respect in his world arrives through reassessment, not humility. At home, the consequences weighed heavier. Haley's reality unraveled piece by piece. Without the startup, her sense of momentum stalled. The loans she had guaranteed followed her relentlessly. Their apartment, once a marker of success, became an anchor she could not carry. She was forced to negotiate, to reduce, to explain. None of it came easily to her. Her attitude toward me changed, though not in the way apologies usually do. She did not reach out directly. There were no attempts at reconciliation or acknowledgement. Instead, she grew quieter around me, guarded and tentative. The sharpness that once defined her certainty dulled into something closer to embarrassment. That shift told me more than any apology might have. Ethan stood between us, exhausted by the strain. He visited less often, but when he did, he lingered longer. Conversations slowed. We spoke about ordinary things, carefully avoiding the deeper cracks beneath them. I could see his perspective shifting, not violently, but reluctantly, as if pieces he believed in were being rearranged against his will. I did not press him. Awareness, I had learned, cannot be forced without breaking something. The attempted retaliation reached me through indirect channels. Haley, desperate to reclaim narrative control, had considered speaking to a local business reporter. She framed the story as a cautionary tale about older investors misusing influence, about family dynamics entangled with financial power. It might have worked if the facts were thin. They were not. The reporter did what competent journalists do. He checked records, filings, transparency disclosures. He found the fund exactly as it was presented, documented, and accountable. The story stalled before it took shape. Haley's leverage vanished with it. I learned about the incident days later and felt nothing but tired relief. Truth does not need defense when it has been consistently maintained. As weeks passed, the tension eased into something quieter and more honest. There was no celebration, no victory lap, only an ongoing adjustment to a reality no one had intended but everyone now lived within. I resumed my routines, unchanged. Walks by the river, work at the school, balancing accounts in the evenings. Yet something fundamental had shifted inside me. I no longer felt obligated to minimize myself to preserve comfort. The boundaries had been redrawn, not aggressively, but visibly. Some lessons arrive gently, others leave marks. This one had done both. By the time the chaos settled, exhaustion replaced anger. Not the kind that demands sleep, but the deeper fatigue that comes from living too long in a state of guarded awareness. I knew then that waiting for things to return to normal was pointless. Normal no longer existed, and pretending otherwise would only invite the same conflict back under a different name. Ethan came to see me one quiet afternoon in Fort Collins. He arrived alone. No announcements, no defenses prepared. We sat at the same kitchen table where years earlier he had spread out math homework and college brochures. The familiarity softened the moment, but it did not erase the damage. He spoke slowly, as if choosing words that could not afford to fail him again. He did not apologize dramatically. He simply admitted that he had allowed ambition to override judgment, that he had confused speed with intelligence and confidence with security. He said he should never have questioned my understanding or motives. The admission was imperfect, but it was honest, and I accepted it for what it was. I told him something equally important, that trust does not survive without boundaries. I loved him without condition, but my financial life was no longer open for interpretation or pressure. I said I would share knowledge, not money as leverage. Guidance, not rescue. He listened without interruption, and for the first time in months, I felt we were speaking as equals. Later that week, I met Robert Lang briefly. Neutral ground, public place. It was not a personal meeting, and we kept it that way. He spoke about markets, about reassessment, about lessons learned during periods of unchecked growth. He never referenced Haley directly, and neither did I. Yet beneath the professional language, there was acknowledgement. Not regret exactly, but recalibration. He asked whether I would consider future collaboration between the fund and his firm. I agreed in principle, but only within clear lines. Business would remain business. Family dynamics would not factor into decisions. He accepted this without argument, which told me more than his words ever could. Haley remained distant. That distance felt appropriate. Some relationships benefit from space, especially when closeness has been used as a weapon. I wished her stability from afar, but I had no intention of restoring intimacy where respect had never truly existed. As life resumed its rhythm, I noticed something subtle but permanent had changed inside me. I no longer adjusted my posture to make others comfortable. I no longer softened truths out of habit. The river near my house still flowed as it always had, but I walked beside it differently now, grounded by the knowledge that I had earned my footing through consistency, not confrontation. Resolution, I learned, is not reconciliation at all costs. It is alignment with values, with facts, with the quiet understanding that allowing access to your life is a choice, not an obligation. Some doors I reopened carefully, others remained closed without regret, and for the first time in a long while, that choice felt like peace. If you are still watching and ready to see how every choice leads to its final consequence, comment number 8 below. The ending brings clarity, not just for the characters, but for anyone who has ever been dismissed. Let us move on to the conclusion. Several months passed before I felt confident enough to say that the dust had truly settled. Not because everything had returned to some imagined version of peace, but because the noise had stopped demanding my attention. What remained were results, quiet and unmistakable. The redevelopment project moved forward exactly as the Front Range Community Development Fund had promised. The property reopened under new management, practical and grounded. It did not sparkle. It functioned. Tenants returned. Cash flow stabilized. Returns came in steadily without headlines or drama. That kind of growth rarely excites people who chase velocity, but it rewards those who understand time. Within the fund, I became something I had never asked to be, a reference point. Not public, not ceremonial, just a name mentioned when reliability was discussed. I declined interviews. I avoided visibility. Influence, I had learned, is most effective when it does not require introduction. My days resumed their familiar rhythm, but with a deeper sense of calm. I no longer felt the need to rehearse explanations in my head. Ethan changed, slowly but visibly. He began setting firmer limits with Haley's family, distancing himself from expectations he had once accepted out of exhaustion. He talked more openly about work, about wanting a career built on skill rather than proximity. Our conversations grew steadier, less fragile. There was no return to dependency. What emerged instead was something healthier. Mutual respect, rebuilt carefully. Haley's life narrowed before it broadened. Without her former position, she faced realities she had never prepared for. She took work that did not come with status or flexibility. Hours mattered. Performance mattered. I heard of her progress through others, never directly. She did not fail, but she no longer floated. That adjustment, I hoped, would serve her better than any apology could have. Robert Lang remained present in his world, though no longer untouchable. His firm restructured, exposure was reduced, some partners stepped away, others stayed, cautious. He adapted because men like him always do, but the aura had thinned. Where there had once been certainty, there was now calculation. I found myself reflecting often on the contrast. Their wealth had relied on leverage, momentum, and confidence that growth would outrun consequence. Mine had grown quietly, inch by inch, through discipline and restraint. Both had produced numbers. Only one had produced resilience. There was no victory to celebrate, no moment worth framing. Everyone stood where their choices had led them. That felt fitting. On quiet evenings, I walked along the same paths I always had, aware of how easily all of this might have gone differently if I had chased approval instead of consistency. Strength, I realized, is not loud. It does not announce itself. It endures. When I looked at my life as it was now, I felt something close to gratitude, not for the conflict, but for the clarity it had forced. We had all been repositioned, and for the first time in years, every piece finally rested where it belonged. With enough distance from the chaos, the story changes shape. What once felt like a battle now looks more like a lesson that refused to be ignored. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, not by erasing them, but by revealing what they were meant to carve. I no longer replay the moments that stung. I understand them. They showed me the cost of staying quiet too long and the strength that comes from finally standing where you belong. For most of my life, I believed that keeping harmony meant making myself smaller, that being reasonable required silence, that love, especially as a mother, meant absorbing discomfort so others could remain at ease. Those beliefs were never questioned until they failed me. What I learned is simple and unsettling. When you consistently step back, people do not see humility. They see absence, and absence invites judgment. The conflict was never truly about money. Money was only the surface language used to disguise something older and more stubborn. Assumptions about age, about relevance, about who was allowed to understand complexity and who should be grateful just to observe. When those assumptions are challenged, the reaction is rarely graceful. Resistance is often the first sign that a quiet truth has reached its mark. What changed most was not my financial position, but my relationship with myself. I stopped explaining choices that had already been carefully made. I stopped softening certainty to appear agreeable. There is a difference between humility and self-erasure, and learning that difference altered everything. I found peace in letting decisions stand without defense. To women who find themselves later in life, wondering if their moment has passed, I offer this without hesitation. Experience is not a limitation. It is leverage. Patience is not weakness. It is strategy. The years you spent learning, enduring, and adjusting were not preparation for disappearance. They were preparation for clarity. Family dynamics may test this truth hardest. Love does not mean unlimited access. It does not excuse disrespect or entitlement. Setting boundaries is not punishment. It is honesty. Sometimes care looks like stepping out of the way and allowing others to meet the consequences of their own choices. When I think now of the phrase small investment, I smile. Small efforts repeated with discipline become formidable. Small voices carried with consistency grow steady and impossible to dismiss. This applies to money, to trust, and to the quiet confidence built over time. My life did not improve because someone else was proven wrong. It improved because I stopped needing that proof. Strength, I have learned, is not loud. It does not rush or demand. It endures, and in enduring, it builds a life that no one else gets to define. Some stories end with noise. Others end with truth, settling quietly into place. This journey was never about winning or proving anything to anyone else. It was about understanding the value of patience, consistency, and self-respect, especially later in life when the world seems eager to rush past you. What lasts is not speed or spectacle, but discipline built over time. What matters is knowing when to stand firm, when to draw boundaries, and when to stop shrinking in order to keep the peace. Life has a way of revealing that the smallest, most overlooked choices often shape the strongest foundations. And real power comes not from being louder than others, but from being certain of who you are when everything is tested. Thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter. Please consider liking, subscribing, and staying with the channel for more stories like this.